How does a failed soldier with no political connections turn Germany's wounded veterans into a political army? Hitler's opportunity came not on a battlefield, but in Munich pubs, where political clubs collapsed under post-war chaos. At that time, he was attached to an army intelligence unit tasked with monitoring radical groups, a role that brought him into contact with the German Workers' Party in 1919. From these beginnings, he exploited veterans who felt abandoned by politicians in Berlin, men with weapons, training, discipline, and no future. Contemporary security reports noted his fiery speeches and potential threat, but many officials dismissed him as a minor agitator, underestimating how effectively he could mold recruits into a political force. That misjudgment becomes clearer when we see how Munich itself, not Berlin, offered the conditions for his rise. Munich after defeat. In the years after Germany's defeat, Munich became a city defined by instability and resentment. Far from the wrangling inside Berlin's parliament, political frustrations ran through beer halls, veterans' clubs, and the streets. The collapse of the short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic left behind an atmosphere of suspicion and violence, and the influx of demobilized soldiers created a volatile mix. For men who carried the trauma of trench warfare and the bitterness of defeat, Munich offered a setting where disappointment hardened into anger and anger sought an outlet. Millions of veterans were sent back into civilian life after 1918. Many found themselves jobless, grieving, and convinced they had been betrayed by politicians. Munich absorbed a striking share of these men, swelling its population with former frontline fighters who could not find work or recognition. These networks of veterans, already disillusioned, soon reorganized into clubs and leagues that posed as social or patriotic associations. They spoke of camaraderie, but in practice they became training grounds for resentment. What united them was not ideology at first, but a shared sense of loss. These gatherings offered Hitler his opening. By the time he joined the German Workers' Party in 1919, he understood that veterans did not want academic arguments or elaborate manifestos. What they wanted was someone to acknowledge their humiliation and confirm their suspicion that Berlin's leaders had turned their sacrifice into defeat. His earliest speeches in Munich did precisely this. Before offering promises of national glory, he told veterans that their bitterness was justified. By affirming their anger, he converted disillusionment into loyalty. Munich also blurred the line between casual life and political life. The beer hall was not just a place to drink. It was where arguments about the Treaty of Versailles, war guilt, and socialism erupted nightly. Unlike Berlin, where official debates stayed in chambers or newspapers, Munich allowed Hitler to test his rhetoric face to face. He could read reactions instantly, adjusting tone, stories, or accusations to hook listeners. Those who carried his words out of the beer hall kept the cycle going. The informal quality of this communication gave him more reach than his modest numbers suggested. The Treaty of Versailles made this discontent worse. Its limits on the army, territorial losses, and crushing reparations gave veterans a vocabulary of betrayal. Munich's nationalist clubs seized on these grievances repeatedly. What official Germany called peace terms were instead narrated as humiliation. Hitler found himself surrounded by an audience already receptive to the story he wanted to tell. He reinforced their anger at Versailles and presented scapegoats for it, sharpening grievances into a political narrative. Another feature of Munich was its tolerance for semi-secret paramilitary life. Versailles had banned militias, yet across Bavaria defensive leagues and youth associations rebranded themselves as sports clubs and labor societies while continuing exercises that resembled military drills. They marched, handled weapons, and practiced discipline under the guise of athletics. These disguised groups gave Hitler exactly what he needed: young men who were already organized, armed, and searching for purpose. When he reached out to them, he discovered a ready-made structure into which his message could be inserted. Authorities consistently underestimated what was happening. Reports out of Berlin prioritized communist uprisings in the capital and overlooked Munich's smaller associations. Even army intelligence, which by the early 1920s had noticed Hitler, officially recorded him only as a minor agitator. This gave him wide freedom to move from tavern to tavern, entering clubs and repeating speeches without serious interference. The misreading of Munich created a blind spot. What looked provincial and irrelevant was becoming an incubator for a dangerous movement. The social landscape made the situation even more combustible. Bavaria had its own character, more Catholic, more regionally proud, and increasingly skeptical of Berlin's secular republican project. Local government switched erratically between left-wing initiatives and conservative crackdowns, cultivating cynicism in every direction. Within that atmosphere, men disenchanted with both socialism and parliamentary liberalism clustered into their own circles. The brew of veteran clubs, paramilitary fronts, and nightly pub debates created an echo chamber in which grievances dominated. Hitler did not need eloquence to thrive there. He only needed to articulate betrayal loudly and often, which to many sounded like truth. Newly digitized membership rolls helped clarify the shape of his early following. While precise numbers are debated, historians now agree that Munich's early recruits were disproportionately unemployed veterans under 30. The pool was concentrated enough to make the city uniquely receptive compared with Berlin, whose larger population was spread across trades, parties, and institutions. This young, embittered demographic turned out to be pivotal. They provided the manpower that Hitler used to transform a fringe presence into a movement. Munich's underground was not only social, but also militarized. Caches of weapons from the war lingered across Bavaria. Private militias maintained arsenals with little official interruption. These conditions made Munich far more dangerous than most cities in Germany during those years. For former soldiers accustomed to hierarchy, Hitler's confidence filled a void. Unlike many politicians, he spoke as though attuned to their experience in the trenches. They accepted him not merely as a speaker, but as a replacement commander. By 1923, the tension in Munich erupted. Encouraged by his followers and convinced Weimar's weakness could be overturned by force, Hitler attempted to seize control in what became the Beer Hall Putsch. The coup failed, and he was arrested. His prison sentence in Landsberg might have ended his trajectory, but it instead gave him time to draft Mein Kampf and refine a political story he would later broadcast nationally. That timeline, joining the DAP in 1919, failing in a coup in 1923, and re-emerging with a manifesto, illustrates why Munich was not just a beginning, but an enduring center of his activity. His spell in prison also hardened his sense of mission. When he returned to Munich after his release, the social spaces he once used for testing rhetoric had not vanished. Beer halls still hosted debates, veterans' halls still gathered the disillusioned, and militia circles still trained under new names. This continuity meant that his failed putsch did not erase his base, but focused it. What had been tested in pubs was being prepared for something larger. Officials again underestimated what was happening. They dismissed ex-soldiers gathering in pubs as harmless storytelling sessions, ignored paramilitary drills under the cover of sports, and confused Hitler's setbacks for final defeat. In reality, these overlooked venues remained the structures through which he grew. The repeated failure of authorities to identify Munich's unique danger gave him a second chance to organize. As these environments persisted, what began as scattered resentment began to look like something closer to a movement awaiting direction. The pools of unemployed, the lingering anger at Versailles, and the fusion of social and paramilitary life gave Hitler an unusual advantage. Munich offered not only a stage, but a training ground for methods of control he was about to perfect. All of this set the stage for the next phase, not just gathering restless men, but choosing from among them those who would become more than followers. In the beer halls of Munich, Hitler began to notice particular individuals who responded to his words with unusual intensity. Identifying and cultivating these men became his next step. Spotting his first lieutenants. When Hitler began addressing Munich's beer halls, the crowds were unsettled gatherings of men searching for direction after the war. Most listened out of curiosity more than conviction. Yet even in those early evenings, Hitler was studying his audience, watching carefully for the handful of faces that leaned closer, eyes fixed on him, as though waiting for an answer only he could provide. These were often men burdened by insecurity and a need for belonging, and they became the first layer of followers who offered him more than applause. His speeches were never simple improvisations. He used calculated pauses to scan the room, noticing who stayed locked on him in the silence. He lowered his voice at times, creating the impression of a secret shared between comrades, even in a crowded hall. And when he repeated a name or remembered a small detail about someone he'd met, the effect was electrifying. A listener went from being just another face to feeling singled out. These theatrical choices were methods of selection, tools not only for persuasion, but for picking out those who would remain devoted. Observers from other political circles dismissed this style as clumsy performance. To them, politics meant serious debate, not staged silences or whispers. But to veterans in the audience, men who felt forgotten in their country's collapse, those very tactics made him stand out. Here was someone who noticed them directly. For ex-soldiers fighting unemployment and humiliation, recognition itself was powerful. Rival politicians offered theories and programs, but Hitler offered intimacy. The way he drew people closer was rarely formal. He did not hand out titles or contracts after the speeches. Instead, he built contact slowly. He would invite someone to walk with him after a meeting or recall a detail in their next encounter. Such gestures might have seemed minor, but for men already consumed with loss and invisibility, they carried immense weight. This practice shrank the distance between Hitler and his audience, transforming a restless crowd into a small core of believers who felt chosen. One of the most telling examples was Rudolf Hess. Hess had survived service in the First World War and then struggled to find direction in academic life. He carried insecure edges beneath his education, doubts about his standing, anxieties about recognition. When Hitler noticed him, Hess found exactly what he had lacked: affirmation. It was not detailed policies that drew him, but the sense of being valued and placed near the center of a movement. From that moment, Hess's devotion was absolute. His attachment revealed how personal recognition could outweigh every other factor in early recruitment. Dietrich Eckart, by contrast, was older and already established in Munich's nationalist scene as a writer and dramatist. He admired Hitler's oratory and believed his voice might reawaken the nationalist cause. Eckart introduced Hitler into cultural and intellectual circles, opening doors beyond the taverns, yet their exchange had limits. Eckart thought he was mentoring Hitler into politics, but Hitler used his respectability to strengthen his own image while continuing to build loyalty elsewhere. It showed Hitler's selectiveness. He valued Eckart's reputation, but reserved his deepest interest for those whose personal loyalty was unquestioning. Recent research into the early members of Hitler's circle has mapped personal and psychological profiles. While exact numbers remain debated, a clear pattern appears. A high share of these recruits had backgrounds marked by fragile social position, troubled careers, or insecurities about class and masculinity. These vulnerabilities did not disqualify them. Instead, they became the very traits that tethered them to his authority. A man who felt overlooked was less likely to desert a leader who finally gave him significance. Where other politicians relied on established professionals, Hitler cultivated those who clung tightly to attention. This approach deepened the divide between him and Germany's traditional elites. The aristocracy and established politicians dismissed Hitler because he had no family pedigree, incomplete education, and a vulgar style. To them, he was a fringe agitator. That dismissal proved useful. Overlooked by elites, Hitler focused entirely on men whose support came not from calculated advantage, but from personal need. By doing so, he created a core of followers that rivals could not dislodge. Their loyalty was not to ideas, but to him directly. The logic of this loyalty emerged quickly. Hess listened to Hitler's words as though they carried sacred meaning. Eckart continued to follow him even as poor health limited his own work, convinced Hitler embodied Germany's destiny. Neither man was chosen for administrative skill or military expertise, but both provided what Hitler valued most: devotion. With them, he set the tone for his recruitment strategy, commitment over competence. That template would guide choices again and again as his movement expanded. The glue that held these early figures together was not only their craving for recognition, it was also shared resentment. They resented Berlin elites who sneered at them, employers who dismissed them, and the new republic that made their sacrifices feel worthless. Hitler gathered these grievances and offered them a sense of purpose. Even without immediate rewards, the perception of belonging to a trusted inner circle gave them meaning. In fractured post-war Germany, that was often enough. Stray listeners in a beer hall slowly turned into true aides, prepared to give up careers, connections, and even their own judgment. Hitler's deliberate techniques, observing carefully, lowering his voice, recalling names, carried them from casual supporters into devoted followers. Rivals missed the potency of this approach, believing politics began and ended with ideas on paper. They did not see how easily personal recognition could build a movement. Archival studies compiled in 2025 underline this point. The first men who joined were not swept in by complex arguments about Germany's future. They were drawn to the sense of intimacy Hitler created, a structure that depended on personal loyalty rather than shared ideology. Rivals ridiculed what they saw as shallow gestures, but those gestures turned into strong bonds. This attention to individual vulnerabilities gave Hitler a tool for creating a disciplined cadre, where others saw only scattered discontent. What resulted was something more durable than agreement over policies. It was a web of devotion strong enough to withstand failures, imprisonment, and ridicule. The insecurities of men like Hess, dismissed by others as weakness, became the very reason they held tight to Hitler. He turned their fragile self-worth into the anchor of allegiance. From these first connections, he built the human framework for his next steps. But choosing men who were loyal did not mean choosing men who were able. Hitler's earliest circle made clear he preferred devotion over talent, a choice that shaped the way his movement operated as it grew. This pattern, placing trust not in the most competent, but in the most obedient, would become central to how he maintained control. Loyalty over competence. Why did Hitler elevate followers who appeared mediocre, hesitant, or poorly suited to leadership roles? To many observers, it was puzzling. Conventional wisdom suggests a rising leader should gather individuals of proven brilliance and skill. But Hitler deliberately inverted that expectation. He considered obedience more valuable than ability. Competence alone was not enough, especially if it came with independence. In his view, trust was measured not by a resume, but by how willing a man was to submit. This approach was a stark break from the norms surrounding him. German generals and civil servants of the time lived by the rules of rank, credentials, and tested ability. Their authority came through measurable accomplishment, military record, education, or bureaucratic training. Hitler disregarded those standards. He sought men who would adopt his words as commands and would never risk diluting his authority. To critics, his choices seemed to confirm that his circle was an unstable band of weak characters. Yet weakness was also what guaranteed their loyalty, and that loyalty was what mattered most to him. Archival documents from the early years confirm how intentional this was. When organizers in Munich demonstrated real administrative ability, they were often treated with suspicion, not gratitude. Independent planning or initiative was regarded as disloyalty. Reports detail cases in which lawyers, teachers, and economists offered frameworks to help the movement operate more efficiently. Instead of elevating them, Hitler marginalized them. Independence, however constructive, was a liability. What he valued instead were men who deferred to his impulses, leaving the image of control firmly in his hands. The way he chose individuals highlights this pattern clearly. Hermann Goering, for instance, was welcomed because of his national prestige as a First World War ace. His reputation carried symbolic force, giving Hitler's cause a veneer of respectability and stirring public enthusiasm. Goering was not admired by Hitler for administrative expertise. Indeed, he was often indulgent and careless, but he stood as a glamorous ornament to the movement. He could enhance Hitler's image without competing for authority. In contrast, Heinrich Himmler had no glamour or battlefield fame. What he brought was studious diligence and absolute conformity. He absorbed tasks with near-obsessive focus, carrying them out exactly as Hitler demanded. Though lacking natural charisma or a decorated record, he presented no challenge to Hitler's leadership. Himmler's ascent into managing the SS was not due to brilliance, but to predictability. By embodying obedience, he proved reliable, and reliability meant survival inside Hitler's structure. Rudolf Hess embodied the same logic in another form. His loyalty was not cautious or strategic, it was consuming. Hess's attachment to Hitler bordered on dependence, and he derived his sense of purpose almost entirely from proximity to him. Though educated and articulate, he brought little practical skill to governing. Yet his need for affirmation made him useful because it ensured there would never be any rivalry. Hess highlights what Hitler appreciated most: devotion so complete it left no room for disobedience. Newly declassified memos reveal how this culture of obedience operated in practice. The rule was simple. Dissent could be voiced once, cautiously, but repeating an objection was dangerous. Disagreement marked a man as unreliable. Those who crossed the line risked being cast aside, losing position, and vanishing from influence. For men whose identity was bound to belonging in the movement, exclusion was a punishment more feared than open disgrace. The result was a silence that reinforced itself. Better to conceal doubts than to risk dismissal. Modern studies comparing Nazi appointees with traditional officials highlight how unusual this system was. Unlike the civil service that supplied bureaucrats deeply trained in administration, many of Hitler's choices had little or no comparable background. Their thread of commonality was loyalty, not skill. The absence of formal preparation would have disqualified them in most professional organizations. Yet for Hitler, these qualities mattered little. What counted was that they posed no threat to the concentration of authority in his hands. Martin Bormann exemplifies this thread even more. Early notes described him as bland and uninspiring, hardly a man destined for power. But it was precisely his predictability and quiet deference that secured his rise. Others, more talented but ambitious, were slowly moved aside. Over time, Bormann's unrelenting devotion opened the path for him to manage Hitler's private affairs and control access to him. His ascent illustrates the larger principle. Qualities dismissed as unimpressive could be transformed into assets if they guaranteed subservience. This choice of loyalty over competence did not mean Hitler was blind to usefulness. He retained figures like Goering for image, Himmler for administrative zeal, and Hess for personal devotion. He exploited the functions they could serve, but only under the condition that none of them stood independent of his will. Competence was tolerated only as long as it coexisted with unquestioned loyalty. If competence threatened to generate authority in its own right, it became too dangerous. To outsiders, this strategy appeared disastrous. Steering a party or a regime with second-rate administrators seemed bound to collapse. Observers mocked the Nazi leadership as amateurish and unstable. But the inefficiency outsiders ridiculed masked an internal logic. These very weaknesses held the system together. Every man knew his position depended not on personal talent, but on performance of loyalty. That knowledge created a constant drive to demonstrate loyalty, which meant affirming Hitler's place again and again. The consequences of this pattern were systemic. Decision-making shifted from reasoned debate toward ritualized displays of devotion. Meetings became less about solving problems and more about confirming allegiance. Competent voices willing to push alternatives were removed or kept at the margins. What grew in place of rational structure was an echo chamber. Obedience drowned out divergence. The circle became an arena where the act of supporting Hitler replaced the act of governing effectively. To maintain pressure, Hitler rarely gave instructions with clarity. Ambiguity encouraged competition. Followers fought to demonstrate closeness to his intent, frequently undercutting one another in pursuit of his favor. The outcome was disorganized administration, but also personal dependence. Men raced for recognition, not by producing results, but by proving alignment with him. Those who thrived, like Goering, Himmler, and Bormann, did so not on the basis of superior skill, but because they embodied pliancy in ways that reassured Hitler he could never be displaced. By shaping his leadership around loyalty, Hitler built a structure that sacrificed efficiency in exchange for total security of his rule. He was surrounded not by rivals, but by custodians of his authority, men whose mediocrity served to magnify his place at the center. This was not by accident. The disorder and incompetence of the Nazi circle were symptoms of a system designed to make power indivisible. In this context, weakness itself became the instrument that sustained dictatorial control. This reliance on pliant loyalty also prepared the ground for the next stage of his project. Once obedience was secured at the top, it needed to be manifested in action at the bottom.